Are we good? Okay, we're on. We'll call the meeting to order, and good morning, everybody. It's 10 o'clock, and happy Monday to everybody. We're going to start our meeting, and we'll start with a roll call.
Narducci?
Here.
Vice President Kaur? Vice President Kaur? Superintendent Hoffman?
Here.
Member Baker?
Here.
Member Broussard?
Present.
Member Burton?
Here.
Member Chang? Member Kay?
Here.
Member Mack?
Here.
Member Ruiz?
Present.
Member Wellborn?
Here.
And I believe Dr. Kaur and Dr. Chang are both on the line now. Is that correct?
Dr. Chang will be on in 5 steps in just a moment.
Thank you. Dr. Kaur? We may have lost him, but you do have a quorum.
Okay, he'll probably patch in. Thank you very much. Well, good morning again. We will commence our meeting. We're going to try to keep this meeting to 2 hours because everybody has a bunch of stuff to do after noon, the noon hour. So we'll start with a call to the public.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board, we have 2 requests to speak. First up, we have Becky Hill, followed by Mark Jornstead.
Thank you. Good morning, President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman. Becky Hill here this morning representing the Arizona Chamber of Commerce. First, on your discussion and possible action on 9 to 12A through F. All of the options before you represent data that is relevant and valid and includes data points already in use in Arizona or elsewhere. None of these suggestions are a stretch. It makes sense to have a growth option focused on the subgroups for whom growth is the most critical and to use the same measures already in use in the larger formula for all students. All options are some versions of this construct, and we trust that the field will come to you today with preferences, and we support those. The one disappointing feature of this plan is that all schools are subject to a change that should really be a pilot just for menu schools. Transparency on pilot results alongside a hold harmless for accountability is a practical approach for these trailblazers who took a leap of faith almost a year ago, but are finding out only this week what their accountability system will look like. It seems impractical to ask the same of the majority of schools not participating in menu. Under the proposed assessment plan that will also be up for discussion, A through F will not include menu for at least 2 more years. Why make all schools change 2 years in a row? We've asked this question, and it turns out there's actually a pretty good but extremely disappointing answer. A separate pilot for just these 55 schools isn't possible due to data encoding issues at the department. Since the board took on the work of updating A through F almost 3 years ago, this has been a common roadblock. Whether it's business rules, managing graduation and dropout data, or not being able to track any number of valid and reliable non-test measures, data and system challenges have stood in the way. With the sharp new leader at the helm, we believe you have the best opportunity now to have data management issues resolved so that the policy management issues aren't playing second fiddle. Right now, really the tail is wagging the dog, and we hope that the board and the department can diagnose the problem, suggest a plan that we can all get behind you to help move forward. For your discussion on the proposed assessment plan, though the initial hard line from USDOE regarding menu made such a plan necessary, the follow-up flexibility in the email from USDOE distributed Friday makes it less so. There is a path for high school menu, and it should be pursued with alacrity. That being said, we support the plan outlined with menu included in the out years. We support the proposed plan because it gives at least 1 full year notice to schools, something that they have been asking for. Are these longer runways for notice? What will the assessment be? What will A through F look like? And regardless of the updated flexibility from USDOE, our schools deserve this plan, and we support it. We appreciate that the plan crosses I's and dots T's so that more schools and students will eventually have this option without regulatory uncertainty. You've all heard, I'm sure, what we've heard. Schools are thrilled. They had a great experience choosing an assessment off menu, and we hope to see this for all schools moving forward. Lastly, as the first public meeting since the release of the USDOE letter, we want to use this forum to express our deep concerns that the USDOE was able to surprise Arizona's education world with the news that AZ Merit has been been under deep enough scrutiny since 2016 to warrant a high-risk designation by the feds. Because I'm dealing with the beep now, I'll just cut to the chase. We hope that whether it's an MOU or a change in the law or just really robust discussions, that there will be a way to figure out how these communications that schools deserve to be aware of and that the state board needs to be aware of in order to do their job can surface more transparently and quickly in the future. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mark Jornstad, followed by Jeff Esposito.
Good morning, President Narducci, Vice President Kaur, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board. I'm Dr. Mark Jornstad, Executive Director of the Arizona School Administrators. Since I last addressed you, the assessment landscape in Arizona has been completely and irrevocably altered. Yet the Arizona School Administrators are not dismayed by this sudden change. In fact, we embrace it as offering clarity and opportunity. Clarity because we now know what the spring of 2020 will bring. Opportunity because the proposal before you offers a chance to refresh a shop-worn AZ merit with an infusion of additional Arizona-generated items and an upgraded moniker. The collaboration I previously hailed between the State Board, the Department, and the Legislature presciently produced Senate Bill 1346, a timely bill that changed the law regarding the menu of assessments. The governor immediately agreed. Now you face a series of decisions, starting today with the high school A through F formula. But now it is only a one-year decision. ASA encourages you to look at the subgroup growth proposal. Though it is not ideal, far from ideal, and it offers a range of challenges to large urban schools, to small rural schools, to charter schools, to traditional public schools, we feel we can live with it for 1 year. Then next spring, we all move on to the new look AZ merit, AZM2, which will provide at grade 9 or grade 10 different opportunities for growth measures. And I agree with some of the remarks that the previous speaker made with regard to that. Please, though, move with dispatch making those decisions. We don't want to be back here a year from now making formula decisions while testing is occurring. And you have a timeline before you that challenges but also allows you to make those decisions ahead of time. So we're not in this situation again. And we thank you in advance for the planning that you're going to do that will meet the needs of educators, families, and Arizona's 1.1 million students.
Lastly, we have Jeff Esposito.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board. For the record, my name is Jeff Esposito. I'm here today on behalf of Unidos US, and mostly I'm just here to say thank you. I know I've spoken here before the board and to many of you individually about the importance of including subgroups within our 8F formula. As Member Baker often says, what gets measured gets done, and we believe that the inclusion of the growth of individual subgroups helps our schools focus on those students who may otherwise be left behind in the process. So thank you very much for taking this important step. I know there is a lot of work to do for the field still, and that we have a lot of conversations to have in the next year, but thank you, Member Mack, for your leadership in proposing this. I do also know that in this process you looked at inclusion of what's known as a super subgroup, the bottom 25%. I do want to state for the record our concern with that sort of approach. Once again, we really prefer that individual subgroups get measured. When we start to aggregate like that, it tends to lose the focus of what is measured getting done. So with that, I just want to say thank you one last time, and hope you have a great rest of your week.
President Narducci, members of the board, that concludes the call to the public.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the comments. We're going to move on to item number 2 on the agenda, which is a presentation, discussion, and possible action regarding the high school 8F accountability system for school year 18 to 19. And there was plenty of information provided prior to this meeting for everybody to read and digest. as well as a lot of work put into this. I believe the report that we received that was part of the agenda, and it was an online, was 27 plus pages. There were also PowerPoints. There was also a presentation provided in March and prior to that. So hopefully every board member has read that and is prepared. And again, this morning, I don't have any questions regarding the report. A lot of work was done. A lot of analysis and data was accomplished. The comments that were made at the board, from the board, were taken into consideration. And I don't have additional data, information, questions, science, assessments, or anything that could change what happened in that report and where we need to go from here. So I'm going to urge the board to consider carefully what has been provided to us and take action today to move forward so that there isn't further delay. I liked the public comment regarding clarity and dispatch. One thing that I don't like about the process in government and probably elsewhere is how long things take to actually get an end product that people can work with. The dispatch is important, the clarity is important, the field needs to know, the kids need to be comfortable, the teachers need to be comfortable with what's going on, and we can't have things just laying out there on an ongoing basis with unknowns. That's my comments, and we'll proceed with item number 2. Alicia.
President Arducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board, I will be presenting to you item 2, which is the subgroup improvement for the growth indicator for the 2018-2019 912 accountability system. So if you recall from the March, let me went ahead of myself. Here's a refresher of what the subgroup growth and improvement looks like. This was provided to you at the March request number 1 for the bottom 25% subgroup, modeled as a subgroup to be included with subgroup improvement. Request number 2 came after the board meeting, and that was from member K, is to look at subgroup improvement just with proficiency. As you recall it, how it's currently stated, we have subgroup proficiency for 10 points, subgroup graduation improvement for 5, and subgroup dropout improvement for 5 for a total of 20. So she requested just looking at proficiency for the full 20. Request number 3 is the consistency of schools with eligible groups. If you recall, the board had some concerns that there'd be major swings year over year looking at those subgroups. Request number 4 was the minimum number of subgroups that schools had access to. There were some concerns that some schools may not have any, whereas some may have a lot. So we looked at that, or the department did. Thank you. Request number 5 is how many times a student was counted within the subgroup. There were some concerns that students could be counted multiple times. And then finally, request number 6 was the grade breakouts compared to the current 17-18 letter grades. So when we look at the request number 1 for the inclusion of the bottom 25% subgroup to the overall subgroup improvement, 2 notes of highlight. You will see that the FRL correlation does increase, as well as the school size correlation increases. When we look at request number 2, this is just looking at subgroup proficiency for the full 20 points. We will see FRL correlation increase, as well as the school size increase. Request number 3 was the consistency. So when you look at the different subgroups, and then you look at the consistency rates, you can see that there's a high probability of consistency from year to year, with the lowest being EL at 90%. Request number 4 was the minimum number of subgroups. When looking at that, you will see that the state average of eligible subgroups is 10, the max is 19, and the minimum is 2. Request number 5 is how many times students are counted in more than one subgroup. The state average number of subgroups that students are in at each school is 1.49. And in an additional handout to these slides, there was a table that broke down by number of students. That can be found on page 6 of 9. That's table 5. Request number 6 was the grade breakouts using approach 7, which is subgroup improvement. Remember, we're using the data from 2017-2018 letter grades, replacing growth with subgroup improvement to get these numbers. You would see an increase of letter grades for 48 schools, or 15%, and you would see a decrease of 44 schools, percent of 14. The largest impact would be between those schools who are D and C schools. The ATAC has met twice prior to today's special meeting. At the first of those 2 meetings, there was an additional proposal put on the table that you see before you in this slide. The proposal was for the board to approve the subgroup improvement indicator in place of the growth measure for the 2018-2019 school year with the following condition: that schools will receive the higher of the 2 grades between subgroup improvement and the letter grade received in the 2017-2018 school year. So if we were to go back to this slide and apply this condition, again, this is using 17-18 data, there would be a potential for 44 schools to receive the 2017-2018 letter grade. And with that, I'm available for any questions.
Take a minute to digest, and then we'll ask some questions. Thank you, Alicia. Okay, let's start with some questions if we have any. Any questions from the board? Patricia.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board. So for each of these requests, the key indicator that we've looked at is the correlation factor. Can you remind us what the current model, what correlation factor exists so that we know what sort of the baseline was?
President Narducci, Member Wellborn, if you give me one moment, I can find that for you.
Thank you.
I got it. Thank you. President Narducci, Member Wellborn, if you look on page 15 of 26 in the document that starts with the contents page, the current model has a negative 0.37 FRL.
I have one other question, please. The component, the caveat that is being proposed that schools will receive the higher of the two grades between the subgroup improvement accountability system from last year, this year, with the letter grade received last year. So we had a big discussion about the whole idea of hold harmless on this, on the issue of any changes we make, especially that it's in a historical fashion, not going forward. And my recollection was that that was not an avenue that we supported. Can you refresh my understanding of that discussion, number one? And if I do remember it correctly, is this not a hold harmless type of approach for this particular component?
President Arducci, Member Wellborn, that conversation came up in the ATAC meeting, and we've been assured that the information and the data that makes up the accountability system for the 18-19 school year would still be reported utilizing this subgroup. However, if the outcome is that their letter grade is lower than it was in 17-18, then they would receive that letter grade from 17-18.
Right. That's what this says. So my question is, was there a discussion about the principle of holding schools harmless to any unintended consequences of changing the accountability system?
President Narducci, Member Wellborn, I'm not sure I understand your question.
Was there somebody else?
President and Member Wellborn, I know I brought up, this is Rita, I know I brought up concerns that that we were changing the measurement from year to year, and that not really knowing the perhaps unintended consequences of this change. I had advocated for the schools of being able to get either their current grade with the old system versus the new. So I may have contributed to this. I didn't think about it necessarily as hold harmless. I thought about it as the difficulty of measuring with one metric year and another metric another year, and definitely in our attempt to get things right may have unintended consequences.
Thank you, Member Chang.
Yeah, and I think the only question that I had in that regard at the last meeting was whether or not it could legally be accomplished, and therefore, if it could be legally accomplished, which apparently it can be, and it's really not holding. This is actually very refined compared to an approach of hold harmless the entire field. So it's just an implementation of a facet in an analysis to actually move things forward.
Right.
That's the way I look at it.
Okay. I have no more questions.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. Seeing none. I'm going to move for a motion. Well, I'm going to request a motion. I'm not going to move for a motion. I'm going to request that we have a motion to accept the proposal and use a subgroup improvement indicator as the growth measure for the 2018-19 school year as presented, and with the condition that schools are awarded the higher of either the 2018-19 accountability letter grade or their 2017-2018 letter grade. Is that the correct motion? From everybody's understanding, is that the motion that I'm asking for? I just want to make sure. Okay. Do I have a motion to that effect?
So moved.
So moved.
So we have Member Mack moving. Dr. Chang, are you a second?
I'm a second.
All right, fantastic. All in favor?
Aye.
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 So we have two on the phone that said aye, correct?
Correct.
Yes, that's correct. Aye.
Fantastic. Any opposed? Thank you very much. It passes. Move on to item number 3. I'll turn it over to you, Catcher, and I think it's for information only.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, and members, as you mentioned, it is information only, discussion only item on the draft assessment plan. Do want to emphasize that it's discussion only right now, and also that it's draft. This is sort of our first read of this, and we've already gotten notes that some of this is probably going to change from when we request the board to take action on it at the April 29th regular meeting. But rest assured, most of those changes are going to be cosmetic on the presentation of it. As we know, the assessment system, when we start building out 3 years or beyond, there's a lot of moving parts, so we want to try to convey that information in a readable way as possible. So some of those changes that'll be happening between now and then are the result of feedback that we're getting from the field on specific policy questions, but also just on the presentation. So I'm going to run through this. I think we would prefer if you could hold off on questions until we get to the end, mainly because there's a lot of moving parts. I think we'll probably answer some of those questions as we get through it, but if not, of course, we're happy to circle up and try to answer what we can at the end. So here's what we're going to be going through today. I always like starting off presentations with an agenda, partially because when I build the PowerPoint, I forget what I'm supposed to do next, so it's a good way for me to refer back. But we're going to be talking about the purpose of the draft assessment plan. This is really why we are here, why we're considering this at all. We'll have the plan itself. We'll have the action timeline. Really, those are the things that the board and the department need to do to actually implement that plan. Those are more board-level action and department-level action and administrative actions. How all of this ties into accountability, because we can't really talk about assessment without talking about its impact on accountability, just as we discussed in the last agenda item. And then what the immediate next steps are for the board and the department, literally this afternoon, later this week, and at the next board meeting. So why are we here? Really, this can be broken up into 2 large buckets, and that's the first point and the second point. I want to take some time to talk about what's on the first point. And really, it's an assessment plan, and building out an assessment plan that's 3 or 5 years down the road is really just good policy. A lot of this ties into what the board had started discussing at the retreat last year, trying to build out and strategically plan some of our big picture items. I think the feedback that we've been getting and the feeling that the board has had is that we've been, sort of going 1 year at a time or playing catch up on some of these big items, and we want to get out in front of some of those. For 1A and 1B, it's really driving out of lessons learned from previous years. So on predictability, for example, the last time that we went to a new statewide assessment was in 2014. The RFP hit the streets in about mid-2014. Contract was awarded in the fall of 2014, and then schools were administering that assessment the following spring. That is a very quick turnaround to write an RFP, evaluate an RFP responses, issue an award, and then ask schools to administer it without field testing it. So that led to some consequences, a lack of buy-in from the field, a lack of knowing what was happening, which is really a cardinal sin when we start talking about trying to provide predictability. We don't want uncertainty, and the fear of the unknown is something we always want to avoid. So trying to learn from some of those with the last assessment system, some of those lessons learned. We want to try to provide predictability, and this plan builds this out over several years so we can build up to where we want to go and let the field know what we're doing and when we're doing it. 1B, again, lessons learned. In 2017, the legislature restricted the board's ability and flexibility to carry out the menu of assessments. That happened for several reasons, policy and otherwise. But one of the reasons that legislation was passed and signed was that the board did not do a great job of communicating out what it was doing, when it was doing it, and why it was doing it. And in order to mitigate some of that happening again, we want to put out something that's more than just our executive summaries, put out something public-facing and put it out there a little more broadly about what we're doing, again, why we're doing it, and when we're doing it, to help communicate to the field and to policymakers all of those items so we can mitigate any miscommunications. I talked about good practice for strategic planning. 1D is really to get an assessment system that we want. We have to plan for it. It's hard to get something when you shove it into a short period of time. For all of these reasons, this assessment plan really had been in the works in some form or fashion going back to late last year, and really started with some of those discussions at the retreat. We didn't talk specifically about assessments, but everything we talked about at the retreat tied in some way to the assessment system. So it was hard to strategically plan around accountability or school improvement or move on when reading and early literacy without also having a plan for what we were doing around assessments. And because all of that stuff was in the works, that's, as Mark said in the public comment, why we had Senate Bill 1346, was already in discussions, introduced, and passed out of committee before we ever got the response from US Ed on the menu waiver response. So we had been talking about a lot of this already, but because of the second point up there on U.S. Department of Education's response to the waiver, we have had to tweak the plan, policy and substance-wise. We've also had to accelerate the timeline. We originally envisioned providing this as sort of a first read to the board, potentially at the April regular board meeting, maybe for adoption in June. Because the feds need a response by the end of May, we've had to pick that up a little bit, which is fortuitous that we had this special meeting already scheduled. This slide is really to give an idea of what went into the thinking behind the building of the assessment plan. We don't have to relitigate everything that's in here because a lot of this was values that were adopted in 2014. This is not the whole list. This is sort of summarized from some of those points. Really, this is just to say what was driving the decisions that went into the plan. And a lot of these still hold true from what was adopted in 2014. Those last two bullet points were added, and that was partially because of what we've received feedback from the field and from elsewhere, and also because the landscape's changed since 2014. It reduced testing, obviously that's the feedback part, and the menu options in high school is where the landscape changed. In 2014, we didn't have the menu yet. So again, we don't have to relitigate these. This is just sort of to give you insight about, and the public insight about what the thinking was in building the plan that I promise is going to come up after this slide, after I stop prepping everybody for all this other stuff. So just one more thing that I want to make sure, because the board hasn't had an opportunity to discuss the waiver response as a board since we received it, wanted to make sure that we walked through it very briefly. So as we all know, statute requires the board to adopt a menu of assessments in both high school and in elementary school. Pursuant to statute, that high school menu was made available this year, and the elementary school menu is scheduled to be made available next year. Of course, with Senate Bill 1346 being passed and signed, that's actually delayed now 4 or 5 years, the elementary school menu. And as we all know, those 55 high schools took advantage of the high school menu in the school year we are currently in, and they are taking ACT or SAT instead of the statewide assessment. In December of 2018, the department, in consultation with others, including board staff, made a request to the U.S. Department of Education asking to waive certain federal requirements. Those federal requirements essentially, if I could sort of summarize, ESSA, the federal law, does allow for what we call the menu, they call the locally selected option in high school. However, ESSA envisions that certain boxes are checked before offering those assessments. Arizona offered those assessments first, and we were going to check the boxes after, similar to how the statewide assessments work. So the waiver request was essentially saying, can we do it like we do with statewide assessments? Can we offer these first, and then we'll check those boxes second? North Dakota had asked for a similar waiver and was granted it, and so that's why that route was taken. On March 28th, US Ed declined that waiver request, placed Arizona on high risk, which is the middle of 3 steps of compliance, and asked Arizona to demonstrate how we were coming into compliance by the end of May, or potentially risk additional enforcement action, which could be withholding a percentage of our Title I Part A dollars. So specifically, in order to come into compliance, the feds requested that we ensure that a single statewide assessment is administered to all students, specifically in high school, but also in elementary school, and made very clear that an elementary school menu fails to comply with the federal law. Now, as I mentioned earlier, federal law does allow for a locally selected option in high school, which is essentially the menu. And that path is still possible for Arizona, and that's something that's still built into this plan. We just need to check those boxes on the front end rather than the back end, and that's going to take more time, which is why we have it built out in year 3, as we'll see. So we have all of these, this is sort of all the setup, so we can get straight into the plan about what we're doing. We broke this out to talk about the immediate next 2 years, and then we'll talk about the out year, the vision year, the Nirvana assessment system year. And I think all of those are member Wellborn suggestions on what we call it, so if you don't like it, you can ask her. So the next 2 years, and again, I want to clarify, and I think this was in the joint letter that went out from the board and the department, when we're talking about all of these fixes or what we're doing, it is not for the current school year. The current school year is going to happen and being tested just as we had always planned. Nothing is changing for those schools or any school in the current school year. Everything we're talking about is beginning next school year and out. So proposing, in order to comply with federal government's recent letter and also to get an assessment system that meets all those values and is what we want it to be, proposing extending AZ merit in elementary school and in high school for the next 2 years. We're going to continue the test question development and refinement, which is led by Arizona educators. A lot of that work has already been happening and has been happening since the inception of the contract for AZ merit. We just want to make it a little more robust, and any questions that we develop as part of that contract for the next 2 years, we get to keep, and potentially for the next assessment system, which is why it's important not only to develop those for future use, but to ensure that the questions we have now are doing everything that we want it to do. So that means in elementary school, we're basically looking at AZ merit the way it's happening right now with some of those test question refinements and developments. In high school, currently we have end of course testing in what is usually 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. That's 3 grade levels of testing. And don't forget, AZ merit is English, language arts, and mathematics. So it's essentially 6 tests through 3 grades. This plan proposes one single summative AZ merit test in either 9th grade or 10th grade. So we'd be going from 3 grade levels of testing to 1, and we'd be going from 6 tests to 2. The either or on 9th or 10th grade is one of the things that we're still going to get feedback from stakeholders on, and that's one of the questions we're going to ask on a survey that's going to be put out tomorrow to try to get more feedback on which grade level makes most sense. And those are things that we can talk about in more detail leading up to that April board meeting, but we'll come with a recommendation based on all that feedback for which grade level we'd like to see that in high school. Again, there's pros and cons to both. So this is what I had just talked about, but graphically, rather than in bullet points. And so this first school year, I realize it says next 2 years, but we have 3 school years up here. This is just the current school year to give you an idea of what we're looking at right now. And then we have the next 2 school years. And you might be wondering, well, what does this mean for menu of assessments? So pursuant to our original understanding of the USED waiver response, and to comply with them, we are proposing that all students are taking AZ merit, regardless of a menu choice. All students are taking AZ merit in high school in the grade designated by the board. The menu, and I think you can probably just ignore this rule for right now, because this is one of those things when I talked about cosmetics, we're going to clean this up. The menu will still be available in the next 2 school years, but they will have to administer AZ merit to all of their students in the grade designated by the board. They could select and administer an assessment from the menu in addition to that one single assessment of AZ merit. And the reason I asked you to kind of ignore this row is because this row is the row that is being paid for by the state. And as you recall at the last board meeting, the board awarded the contract for menu to ACT, Cambridge, and Pearson. And the reason that this distinction is important is that if these assessments, this row would basically be what was happening for the last 4 or 5 years. Schools could administer those assessments. They just have to pay for them, and it's not in lieu of the statewide assessment. So really, like I said, just kind of focus on this last row, and we'll probably take this one out for clarity. So what does the vision year look like, the nirvana year? This is the year that we want to get to. This is essentially life after AZ merit. In elementary school, all schools are going to administer a new single statewide assessment. And you'll see after stakeholder meetings and field testing. The benefit of planning this out for year 3 is that we have time this summer, beginning this summer, to have stakeholder meetings about what the field and what policymakers want in a new assessment. I'm sure they have a list already ready of what they don't or do like about AZ merit and what we can keep or change for the new contract. We can have robust stakeholder meetings, and we can put out an RFP that I think we all feel good about. And then we can field test that new assessment one whole school year before administering it fully. And that's something that really is best practice, but something we didn't do last time that will help mitigate some of those challenges we faced this time around. And that will help with ensuring that the questions aren't biased, with ensuring that any administrative hiccups with a whole new vendor are, if not totally ironed out, at least we have an idea of where the pitfalls may be. In high school, the proposal is a little more nuanced and a little more complicated. In order to satisfy both the menu of assessments, which is the state requirement that we offer that, and US Ed's requirements, which include comparability of scores, alignment to standards, uniformity of accommodations, all of that good stuff. We are proposing the board adopt one assessment system, which would be an 11th grade college entrance exam that also offers a 9th grade, what we're calling a pre-test, a preparatory test. So that's one vendor offering 2 tests in high school, one of them, the 11th grade one, being the college entrance exam. And that's what we would assume most schools would administer, and that's what we would designate as our statewide assessment. Now, in order to provide the menu of assessments, to provide that option and that locally selected option under federal law, we would also adopt under the menu a different college entrance exam in 11th grade that also offers a 9th grade pre-test. So let me show it to you graphically, if this helps. So in elementary school, we have our new single statewide assessment that was field tested the prior year. We would have our new high school assessment system, which is a 9th grade and an 11th grade test, which are college entrance tests, at least the 11th grade one, also field tested the year prior. And then we would allow schools to select a different nationally recognized college entrance test that offers 9th and 11th grade. And you'll see an important note here in italics. This is dependent on some factors. And those I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. Here's the whole full 3 years. Again, I realize there's 4 years here, but we're giving you the status quo year as a point of reference. So in order to make the menu work, pursuant to the federal law, we have to do some of these things in this middle bullet point. But like I said, because we have a couple years to do it, we feel confident that we can start getting on a path towards doing that. If you recall, and we've had a few years to learn about what to do or what not to do in the next couple of years. We also have other states like Oklahoma, which offers ACT and SAT essentially as options, which is more or less what we're looking at for this proposed plan. So we have another state to look to that is a little further down the road on what we're looking at that has not received an unkind letter from the federal government. And so we feel that is a solid path forward to accomplish both the state asks for a menu and also the federal requirements that are laid out. The first bullet point, again, is reemphasizing. You'll notice on all of the big 3-year plan, there's nothing about the 3.8 menu of assessments. The federal government did indicate that it fails to comply and essentially told us not to do that. Now, the legislation that was just passed and signed, 1346, does require the board to at least explore having a 3.8 menu of assessments. So when we revise this plan, we will add 2 additional years, which is essentially copied and pasted from our vision year 21-22, but it'll be 2 additional years. but we will have to put something in there about what are we doing to explore the 3.8 menu of assessments. I think the board would propose that we continue to have discussions with the federal government about it in cooperation with the department and other stakeholders. But right now, the letter that we received from the federal government is pretty clear and strong that that's not currently allowable under federal law and that they have not issued a waiver for that previously. So that's something that we'll look for when we build this out. And then the final bullet point here that I want to emphasize is that if in 3 years we are where we are now, where we tried to do menu and the federal government for whatever reason said you can't do that, or you didn't do it right, or they don't like the options that we provided, or what have you, we still feel like the plan will have an assessment system that is still valuable, that still meets what we want to look for, and that we wouldn't be between a rock and a hard place. It wouldn't be where we would want to be, but at least we have a fallback option. So if there's concerns about going down a path with no return, we feel like we would still have a place where we would like to be, if not the ultimate nirvana. This timeline is really just something to keep the board and the department accountable. Like I said before, this is sort of all of the implementation times of when all of this is happening. This timeline is what the board needs to do to get there. And we could have gone into a lot more detail at the staff level, both at the board and the department, about everything that goes in here, but we wanted to try to give a broad picture of when we envision things happening and trying to stick to this as best as possible and holding ourselves accountable for keeping the ball moving forward. We provided, this 3-year plan with ample enough time to get there, so we have to hold ourselves accountable to keep the ball moving to actually get there. Trying to remember if there was something. I'll go with that later. This is a brief slide about how all of this plays into accountability. The first bullet point we already did, so we're a third of the way there. For 1920 and 2021, for elementary school, because we are not robustly changing the elementary school assessment system, and because we want to continue to provide predictability and consistency in accountability, we're envisioning an accountability system in elementary school that largely remains the same. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't take steps to ensure that, it's refined, and we did some of those refinements to elementary school this year around the business rules. And there may still need to be changes around the edges as issues pop up and we continue to perfect the system. But by and large, this proposal envisions an elementary school A to F system that is largely the same for the next 2 years. In high school, as we had talked about earlier, the system that we just adopted was really a 1-year system. And that's because when we move to next year and the year after that, every student is going to be taking that high school assessment in either 9th or 10th grade. So now we can build out growth and we don't have to crosswalk proficiency across multiple assessments, which is something that was giving us a lot of heartburn. Now, we may have to build out and change and tweak our CCRI system depending on what happens with menu. And then there's other things that we've been talking about in high school, like on track to graduate, that we may want to consider introducing. And then beyond, when we move to our new assessment system, obviously, we might need to make some changes for what that new assessment is in elementary school, and then in high school, when we then have to integrate those two options from the high school menu in the 21-22 school year, we will hopefully have time to build out what that looks like on the comparability side. So immediate next steps. This isn't on the slide, but later today we have a meeting with some superintendents to get feedback on the assessment plan, specifically some of the questions that we raised that are still kind of not up in the air, but things that we want to get feedback on. We're also going to be putting out a survey, hopefully by the end of the day tomorrow, to get feedback on this from the public and also from the field. That'll be in preparation for that April 29th board meeting, which will be extending that AZ Merit, that AIR contract, which is the vendor for AZ Merit, in both high school and elementary school. Now, we want to do it for 2 years, but we have to do that contract 1 year at a time. So it'll show up as a 1-year extension, but we have to come back next year to do another year, and that's just the way the contract's laid out. We're also proposing changing the name of the assessment of AZ Merit. Now, part of the reason that we want to change the name is, one, Senate Bill 1346 was passed with a group of stakeholders, and including Senator Allen, who allowed that bill to go on, and Representative Udall, who sponsored that striker, with the understanding that the name of AZ Merit would be changing. There's also good policy reasons to change that name, specifically, and what we hear mostly is that the acronym does not accurately reflect what it actually does, and that's the IT part of AZ Merit, which is informed teaching. And we've heard a lot of feedback that the assessment, because the scores aren't returned in an adequate enough time and the data isn't in depth and deep dive enough, doesn't appropriately inform teaching. There's also that continued test item development and refinement issue that we had talked about earlier, and then we will need to designate which grade that new assessment will be administered in high school. And again, when I say new assessment, it means a name change on it and the grade level change. Now, the assessment will need to be a little bit different because we have end of course tests, and we're not just taking the end of course test, we're making a summative. But that probably wasn't clear, but you can ask me questions after. So then obviously we have to communicate all of this to U.S. Department of Education by the end of May about here's how we're doing to satisfy your letter. Please don't take our money. And then adopt the 3-year assessment plan and consider policies for how that menu, that optional menu, will work. It changes the game a little bit because those assessments won't be in lieu of the statewide assessment anymore. So we might be able to be a little more flexible in terms of things like testing windows and when scores need to be returned and all the sorts of stuff that we were wringing our hands about last year. So before I wrap up and ask for questions, I'll just remind you that the 2 other things that we're going to bring next time is that the plan is going to go from 3 years to 5 years, because that's what we had said in our joint letter, and also that we're going to come with a recommendation on which grade level to administer that high school assessment. So with that, we are available for questions.
Well done, Catcher. Appreciate all that. It's well described, and thank you for leading us through all that. Let's start on the phone. Any questions from the phone? Dr. Kaur, Dr. Chang.
No, thank you, Luke. Very well explained.
And I'm good too. Thank you for that, and I've got a sense of our path forward.
Thank you. Around the table. Tricia.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, members of the board. So with the extension of AZ Merit proposed for 2 more years, and recognizing, as you did, there's been some significant feedback to us and others about the shortcomings of AZ Merit. What opportunity is there to kind of improve some of those things, such as, in particular, the feedback to teachers? Is there going to be, in this timeline that you proposed, is there going to be any opportunity to try to make some of those improvements?
President Narducci, Member Wellborn, do you mean for the next 2 years of
Right. So
AZ
for the
Merit?
next 2 years that we're going to have AZ Merit, and we're going to refine it with additional tested questions. I heard that part, but I also would like to know what other opportunities we can introduce to it to improve feedback to teachers.
President Narducci and Member Wellborn, I know that we've had some conversations with some of the policy folks about that exact question, what can we do in terms of providing better data or more readable data? I think there's still going to be a fundamental issue in that a lot of the concerns stem from a physical and literal lack of data because the test is so short. And if we were to provide, in order to provide better and more complete and robust and specific data, the feedback that we've received from the department is that the test would have to be lengthened. And I don't know if that's something that is within our existing test bank without pulling from AIRS items, and I don't know if that would have financial costs associated with it, but we have had conversations about, with the data that we do have available, is there a better way to present it? But we can look into that and try to get more clarity on what we can do in the next 2 years.
Well, I've also heard that Ames was more effective in providing feedback to teachers, and I understood that was a shorter test.
President Narducci, Member Wellborn, I can only speak from, I took Ames, but not Easy Merit. I'm not that young. But
Maybe we could have an educator address that. I'm not an educator, so.
We'll work with the department on what we can do in the next 2 years, if anything. And I mean, part of that, I think I hear where you're going in that we don't want to just say in 3 years it's going to be great, so just sit tight for 2 years. But a lot of those discussions are things that we can really start diving deep on over the summer to build out for that new assessment. But I hear you. We'll work with the department.
Thank you, Member Warren. Member Baker.
President Narducci, I also want to say, Ketcher, outstanding presentation, really helpful. 2 questions. One, on slide about halfway through in the 3-year draft assessment, you reference, you have a bullet, the bullet references a summative AZ merit in either 9th or 10th grade. Can you just talk about that a little bit more? Because right now the high school AZ merit is not summative, it's end of course. So what does that mean? What does that look like, and how do we get there if it's going to be summative?
President Narducci and Member Baker, so I guess I'll start with which students would be taking that assessment. It would no longer be tied to the course that they're in.
All students.
It would just be all students in that grade. It's also my understanding from the assessment folks at the department that we've always had the ability to de-scope those end-of-course assessments into a summative assessment. So that 9th or 10th grade assessment wouldn't necessarily be the Algebra 1 end-of-course math. It might be a little bit different once we start pulling in other questions because it's now summative and not end-of-course. And I don't know if Audra's with assessment is maybe shaking her head. But that's my understanding. It would be tied no longer to the course, but to the grade level, and it might be a little bit different of an exam from the end of course that we usually associate being taken in that grade.
Okay.
And I think
that's a very significant issue for those of us who prepare students for that test. It's not a question, it's just a comment that I'm sure everybody's tuned into, but somebody ought to put it on the table, and that is we sit around the table here as adults and come up with these great plans. There's also 9th and 10th graders who sit around the table in the cafeteria and go, so what's this test next week? Why should we work at that? And there's not a good answer to that question right now. And I don't have an answer, but it should at least be put on the table that's huge, how kids respond to this, because 14, 15, and 16-year-olds don't just do what they're told to do because we want them to. Second question is, as we cast our vision to the future, and I appreciate that focus on your presentation, has there been discussion and on the issue of aligning our vision for 3.8 with our vision for 9.12? Because if our vision for 3.8 is in one direction toward one target, and then in high school everybody's taking a hard left or a right turn from an instructional perspective, that's a problem.
President Narducci and Member Bake, I was just given breathing room to see if Alicia, as a former practitioner, wanted to jump in.
I was jumping in. You beat me. Yes.
Well, I already started talking. Yes, we have had some of those conversations, and specifically for I think I had outlined this earlier. The reason the high school system the high school vision system is proposed the way it is because we feel like, not that that's the only path, but really that's the best path to have both a menu and comply with federal law. And there is a way for us to align the 3.8 assessment system with that high school assessment system. And, I think there are products out there that, have a whole suite that can make that happen. And I think there's also work that's been done in other states that aligns, a high school college entrance exam with a 3.8 assessment that, maybe is from a different vendor. But I think we have also heard, I think where you were going, we've heard that as well. And now I'll stop rambling to see if Alicia wanted to jump in.
President Narducci, Member Baker, members of the board, I also think that a lot of those conversations would have to occur when we're developing that RFP for that 3.8 menu, or I'm sorry, 3.8 statewide assessment. And the board is one of those stakeholders. So I think, that type of want, if it's a want from the field or from the board members, would be addressed when we develop that RFP.
I just want to make the point that it's a critical issue, and hopefully the standards that are approved by the state and the instruction that occurs in the classroom and the test that is given, all three of those components match each other and are not different.
Thank you, Member Baker. Any other questions or comments? Member Reese.
President Narducci, Superintendent Hoffman, and members. I'm going to piggyback a little bit on the big picture, the vision, and I look at our state, and the state continues to just change dramatically, and it's much more diverse than it has ever been before. And we have, as a policy, the state wants to educate not only its citizens but its residents. It's in its best interest. But we also want to measure how are we doing. And we administer these tests to our kids. And sometimes it measures academic performance. And a lot of times it just measures kids' situation, socioeconomic situation at that time in their lives. And how do you create a test that gives an equal measurement of where students are and their families, academically, socioeconomically, so we get a measurement of how are we doing? Not necessarily how's that kid doing, how are we doing? And as we develop this assessment plan in the next couple of years, I think it's sometimes just taking a step back and going, what are we trying to do? And does it accomplish that? In our state, we have these minority, urban, economic, or low economic areas, and then we have other communities that are quite opposite. And then we have rural Arizona, and we've got these three different these groups. When we talked about subgroups earlier, I was kind of chuckling because if you add up Latinos, Native Americans, African American group, that's not a subgroup anymore. That's the majority. It's a majority group, and we have to take all these things into account. And I just hope that what we don't fall into, and I'm really positive today. I feel really good about the vote we took earlier. Because I think it was these steps in recognizing that Arizona is diverse. It's different. We have a common goal, and that is a great education, a super education for all our kids. We don't want exams to be overly punitive, and I would not argue at the same time that it just doesn't incentivize certain socioeconomic groups. I think we got to take all these things into account as we move forward. I'm really hopeful. I think that the work that's been done in the last year, but what I've been able to see in the last 3 or 4 months, because I'm one of the new kids on the block, is I think it's hopeful for where we're trying to go with education in the state. So, thank you.
Thank you, Member Ruiz. Anybody else? I just have two questions. Don't want to delay the discussion any further. You mentioned that we moved in sometime in 18 or 16 or 17, whatever it was, in light of North Dakota's proposal, and that North Dakota's proposal was accepted. Why was theirs accepted, and how was it different, or how was the approach different? Do you know?
President Narducci, I don't know specifically. No,
Okay.
I do remember when we had discussions late last year that there was a feeling of confidence that as a result of their waiver going through, that there was a degree of confidence that we would be okay. I don't know specifically how and why they were different, but they had to have been in some form or fashion, and I don't.
Okay, and there are other states that have menus.
President
number of
Narducci,
them, right?
Yes, yep. So Oklahoma and I think Georgia or West Virginia is exploring it as well, but Oklahoma
Okay,
does right
that's what I
now.
thought.
And
All right. So even though I've read a lot of federal letters throughout my legal career, and they probably don't scare me as much as as other people, because you read between the lines, and sometimes before the lines are written, there's things that happen. But here's my takeaway from it, and tell me if I'm wrong, that menus are possible. So what's on the books, we can actually move forward and try to implement. That the menus have been okayed in other states. There's no reason why our state cannot pull together the data that's necessary to have menus be successful in our state, whether it be 3 through 8 or high school. I know 3 through 8 has its own issues. And that we need to support the menu selection as we go forward with the data. And the data needs to be, because that was the big thing that I pictured in the letter. The data needs to be pulled together timely, effectively, and accurately to support what we want to do. And I think we probably would not have had this letter had that been accomplished. And then we just need to implement. And the implementation needs to happen sooner than later, because I have heard from members of the board, since I've been on the board, that a menu is a good thing for us to have for various reasons. And what I hear from members of the board has actually been filled from the field. So I don't take the letter from the feds as a bad thing. I just think that it's a charge for us to actually do things a little differently than we have done, so that we can actually get things on the books and move forward. All right, Member Mack.
I guess I just have a little clarification on the slide that's entitled Notes on Draft 3-Year Plan. My major concern is the middle point that says high school menu may be implemented, but it requires federal peer overview standards alignment, accommodations, uniformity, comparability of assessments for accountability. When and how will some of these things be done so that we're not finding ourselves in a similar position? I just want to get on it early.
yeah, President Narducci and Member Mack, that's part of the reason why the out year is not next year, not the year after that, but 3 years, and it's because that will take time. And as I had mentioned earlier, usually with a statewide assessment, you can do some of that stuff on the back end. We will have to do it on the front end in order to work on that. So that is stuff that will have to happen and begin to happen later this year in order to check those boxes. And to President Narducci's earlier point, there was a public comment earlier about, another recent communication from well, it actually wasn't from USAID directly, but on Friday, another communication. That's something that we're still looking into, and I think we probably want to get on a larger joint phone call with USAID to get clarification on what it is they're asking. I think we still feel like this plan is good, but whenever you're dealing with, albeit for me to speak as a state government employee, but whenever you're dealing with a large bureaucracy, certainly want to make sure we're getting a clear message on what's expected from us and what they're asking for us moving forward. So that's something that we're going to continue to run down.
Okay, anything else? Superintendent Douglas. Not Superintendent Douglas. Yeah, Hoffman. Old habits are hard to break. Sorry.
Thank you, President Narducci and members of the board. So just a couple comments, because I've been in a lot of these conversations as well. And so first I wanted to say thank you to President Narducci and the board staff for helping put together this plan and also co-signing the letter that we sent out to the field, because I think that showing that unity that we are planning together is a really important point for everyone to know that these conversations have been happening since January, since we came into office, and our priority has always been and continues to be having that stability in the field and being very transparent about the conversations that are taking place in this plan that continues to evolve. But I really appreciate having this plan and presentation from Catcher too. So just a couple comments. I wanted to be clear too that from the letter from the U.S. Department of Education, it was made very clear to us, and also afterwards we also had conversations with the Department of Education that there is no pathway forward for menu in grades 3 through 8. I just want to make sure that's really clear that we are pursuing this pathway forward for high school, but it was made very clear to us that there's no pathway forward for grades 3 through 8. Second, that even with the menu in high school, the state would still need to designate an assessment. So I don't know which assessment that would be, but even with menu options, we would still have to say that this assessment is our state assessment, and then the others are alternative assessments, basically, or other choices that districts and LEAs could pick from. So for example, in Oklahoma, they have designated one assessment to be their state assessment, and then the other options are just the menu. So there is a pathway forward, but we would still need to designate one. And then back to Member Baker's comments about aligning. When I was talking with other states about what they've done for states that have moved for states that have gone in the direction of offering the SAT and the ACT in high school as their state assessments, many of them still have a state assessment in their high school. So for example, Utah, they have a state assessment in 9th and 10th grade, so their version of the AZ Merit. And then in 11th grade, all the students take the ACT. So that's one way that they help keep the alignment going from the lower grades to the upper grades, is they still offer that state assessment, but then they wanted to have that college readiness exam by offering the ACT. So there are some other states to look to see what are some other options in terms of how do we align our standards to the assessments. I know when I was talking with the state superintendent from Oklahoma, she talked about that they also made changes to their standards in the lower levels to help align their standards to the high school assessment. So there are things that we can do to find alignment, but of course it's complicated and will definitely take a lot of conversations for us to get there. But I think that with the great collaboration we've already seen and I'm just so happy to be a part of, that there is a pathway forward. And I think we'll get there, but these are great conversations to have.
Thank you, Superintendent. Okay, with that, seeing there's nothing further for discussion, we'll move on to the next item. Alicia, I just had to pull a Superintendent Hoffman on you since you did the last meeting. Called her Superintendent Hoffman last meeting. I decided to do it this time. I'm sorry, Superintendent Douglas. Yeah.
I think Alicia had a fever last time. So give her a pass.
President Arducci, Superintendent Hoffman, that is correct. I did have a fever and strep, so yeah, that's true. I was delirious.
Item number 4. We are going to move for a motion to move into executive session to discuss a lawsuit that the board and ADE are involved in. So could I have it is item number 3, item number 4. So do I have a motion to move into executive session for consultation with the board's attorneys regarding the case Equality versus Hoffman, CV number 19, whatever it says on the agenda, and do I have a motion in that regard?
So moved.
We have a motion from Jill. Do I have a second?
Second.
And we have a second from Christine. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, we'll have to hang up on the phone, call in, so it'll be a couple of minutes, and then we'll meet in the back room. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Convince myself now. Yeah.
Hi, do we have anybody on the line?
Everyone else has left the call.
We're good? Awesome. We're out of executive session, and we have I think, the entire board back, 2 on the phone, and everyone else at the table. And after executive session, we'd like to direct Alicia.
No. President Arducci, members of the board, the last agenda item is summary of current events, future meeting dates, and items for future agendas. And we'll see all of you on the 29th of April for our regularly scheduled board meeting.
Well, thank you. One of the things for the next session that I'd like to have considered by the board is moving our meetings from 9 to 10.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a suggestion to have, so we'll put that on the agenda potentially for the next meeting. If we have to put it on the agenda. I don't even know what we need to do. Okay. Anything else that you want to suggest for the agenda for next time? Without discussion, just an agenda item.
And President Narducci, just be clear, if any additional agenda items are suggested, they will not make it in time for the April 29th board
Okay,
meeting.
then forget what I
Because you've
said.
already set the agenda.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
We are over with. Thank you very much. And it's 11:45. We finished 15 minutes early. Thanks for being here, and thanks for being informed and prepared. Thanks.
Thank you.
We are adjourned.